The night my son first spoke the truth to me felt like the world had paused, as if even the air refused to move, and though I had long sensed a weight inside him, the words struck me like a quiet explosion in my chest. We sat on the small balcony of our apartment in Dallas, city lights glowing softly beneath us, and the warm night carried a gentle promise that everything might somehow be okay. He seemed older than his years, thinner, more fragile, yet his eyes held a sharp awareness that both frightened and amazed me. He asked if he would ever be cured, if one day he could wake up free from fear, from the voices, from the relentless effort it took to just remain present. I drew a slow breath, seeking words that would neither crush him nor deceive him, and told him that schizophrenia had no cure, yet treatment, care, and understanding could still allow a meaningful life. The pain etched on his face was immediate, raw, and he asked how he could ever be happy, knowing he might lose control or hurt someone he loved, like he had almost done before. I held his cold hands despite the warm night and told him he was not defined by his illness, that he was intelligent, sensitive, creative, and that awareness was a strength, even if it did not feel like it. He listened, absorbing each word, then admitted his fear that he might never have a normal life, no partner, no family, no future. I explained that normal was not one shape, and that many people lived full lives carrying heavy burdens, even if their paths were harder and different. I promised we would never abandon him, and when he smiled with that mixture of gratitude and guilt, I felt hope and terror entwined inside me. That night, as I lay waiting for my husband to come home, I reflected on all that had changed: the diagnosis, the hospital stays, the move to Dallas, the careful rebuilding of our lives around a fragile reality. It had been our hardest year, but also one that revealed depths of love and resilience I had never known. I fell asleep believing peace had finally arrived, unaware it was the last quiet night before everything would shatter. In November 1995, my husband called to say he would be late with work, and told me not to wait. I had dinner with my son, watched television, and talked about his upcoming birthday before he took his medication, and went to bed. I stayed awake knitting a sweater for my husband, imagining his smile when he opened it on Christmas. Hours passed until exhaustion took me, and I left a note saying I loved him. The phone rang before dawn, and in that moment I knew life would never be the same. The voice on the other end trembled and confused, and when the words formed they hit me like a physical blow. My husband was gone, murdered in a senseless act of violence, far from home. My mind rejected the truth, clinging to denial as if it could shield me, but reality does not bend to hope. When the sun rose, I faced an impossible task: telling my fragile son his father was dead, and as I watched his expression shift into something distant, hollow, I realized grief would not arrive gently. It would come intertwined with illness, with fear, with voices that told him lies and stole his sense of safety. That was the beginning of a journey testing every piece of me, as a mother, a wife, a woman. It was the moment survival replaced dreams and love became an act of endurance. This story begins there, not with answers or miracles, but with loss, confusion, and a promise I made that no matter how dark the road, I would not abandon my child, even if the world fell apart. The days after my husband's death moved like a strange fog, time losing meaning, every sound too loud, too sharp. I remember standing in the funeral home holding my son's hand while people whispered condolences and looked at us with pity that made my skin crawl. My son barely spoke, his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders tense as if bracing for an invisible blow. At night, the voices returned stronger, telling him the tragedy was his fault. He should have known something bad was coming, that he did not deserve to live. While his father was gone, I sat beside him, listening to him argue with voices only he could hear, my heart breaking with every word. The medication that once helped now seemed too weak, and his psychiatrist warned that severe stress could trigger a dangerous relapse. I nodded, pretending understanding, while inside I screamed because grief was already more than I could bear. Letting go was impossible because my son needed me more than ever. I cancelled work commitments, stopped answering most calls, focused entirely on keeping our small world from collapsing. Some mornings he refused to get out of bed, convinced strangers watched him through walls. Other days he followed me room to room, afraid losing sight meant something terrible. I learned to sleep lightly, always listening for movement, whispers, signs that he was slipping from reality. Friends tried to help, but did not know how to talk to him or to me. Slowly their visits shortened, then stopped. The house felt emptier without my husband, heavier with unspoken fear. I struggled with my grief, crying silently in the shower so my son would not hear, afraid my pain would deepen. His absence echoed everywhere, the kitchen chair he never filled again, quiet evenings, no one coming home late, and in the questions he asked about why bad things happen to good people, I had no answers, only presence. I cooked simple meals even when neither of us felt hungry, reminded him to take medication even when he insisted it was poison, drove him to appointments, sat through long sessions where doctors spoke carefully about stability, risk, long-term care. I felt myself aging rapidly, carrying responsibilities that once belonged to two, yet beneath exhaustion a fierce determination grew. I would not let tragedy define my son's future. I would not let fear steal small pieces of hope. Each night before sleeping I told him he was safe, he was loved, Tomorrow we would try again, even when I doubted my own words. I said them because survival sometimes begins with repetition, not certainty. This was how we lived, one day at a time, balancing grief and illness, learning to exist in a world suddenly unpredictable, cruel. And though I did not know it yet, hardest moments waited quietly just beyond fragile calm. We tried desperately to protect. The first break came without warning on a cold morning when I found him standing staring at the wall, pale body rigid as if turned to stone. I called his name again and again, but he did not respond. His lips moved silently, and when he spoke it was to say the wall was speaking, showing things he was not meant to see. Panic rose inside, but I forced calm, knowing fear would feed the storm. I guided him to the couch, wrapped a blanket, called his doctor, who told me to bring him to the hospital immediately. The drive felt endless, every red light an obstacle, every mile a test of my strength. He rocked back and forth, covering ears, begging voices to stop while I whispered reassurances. I was not sure he heard at the ER. Bright lights, sharp smells overwhelmed him. It took 3 nurses and a security guard to settle him without harm. I signed forms, shaking, feeling relief and guilt as they led him away. The waiting room nearly empty, and for the first time since my husband's death I allowed myself to cry openly. Weight pressing. When the psychiatrist explained admission was necessary, I nodded. Instinct screamed to protect him from locked doors, sterile halls, days blurred. I visited daily, sitting beside him as he lay withdrawn, staring at nothing, eyes dulled by medication. He asked if I abandoned him. The question cut deeper than any accusation. I told him repeatedly this was temporary. I was there. He was not alone. Slowly medication quieted voices but stole pieces of personality, leaving him tired, distant. Doctors spoke of long-term management, importance of routine and structure. I listened because his life depended on it. When discharged, home no longer felt like refuge but fragile balance that could tip. I rearranged life around his needs, schedules, reminders, quiet spaces where he could feel safe. We spoke less about future, more about getting through each day, one step, one breath, one moment at a time. This was reality we were learning, not because fair but because only way forward. And even as exhaustion threatened, I held a small, stubborn belief somewhere beyond suffering there had to be meaning, even if unseen. When he came home after hospitalization, something shifted, and I felt it in his careful movements through house. He followed routines we built together, took medication, ate when reminded, spoke softly, but spark once lit. Curiosity dimmer replaced by caution. I told myself stability, survival, but mourned parts lost, months past, fragile rhythm. I tried to rebuild normalcy, returning to part-time work, forcing myself to answer phone. Yet as I began to believe we might manage life, another blow arrived quietly without mercy. It started with headaches, sleepless nights, then restlessness, pacing thoughts raced faster than words. Doctor adjusted, medication assured temporary, but instincts told something was wrong. One evening found him sitting on floor, surrounded by scattered papers, frantic writing, symbols, phrases made no sense. He looked up, fear in eyes, said mind slipping, voices learning to hide from medicine. That night he barely slept, neither did I, listening to whispers outside his door, ready to intervene at dawn. He asked if life already over, if this all he would ever be. A week later, inevitable happened, another breakdown, another set of forms signed with trembling hands, but this time stay longer, harder. Doctors spoke more openly about prognosis, chronic illness, limits. My son grew angry, accusing me of controlling life, choosing doctors over freedom. Though I understood pain, each word felt like knife. I stayed calm, outside, inside, fracturing, stretched thin between love, exhaustion. During one visit he screamed he wished he had died instead of father. For a moment room spun, had to grip chair, realized grief had never left, simply changed shape, feeding illness, hollowing me. When discharged again, quieter than ever, withdrawn, distrustful. Our home became heavy, silence, wondered how long could keep going. Alone nights I stared at ceiling, asking why husband left me to do this, why son suffer so deeply. Felt anger, guilt, shame, all tangled, barely recognized emotions. And yet each morning got up, made breakfast, reminded, pills, told we would keep trying, giving up not an option. This was darkest chapter. Faith felt foolish, strength borrowed, yet in darkness something quiet began, resistance, not loud, heroic, but steady. I did not know then this period of despair shaping both of us, preparing for change, unexpected place, altering course of our lives in ways unimaginable. The days after the second long hospital stay were measured not in hours or minutes, but in the fragile rhythm of keeping my son calm, safe, and alive. Each morning began with the same ritual. I would wake before him, make coffee, sit quietly, and gather strength to face another day. Then I would gently knock on his door, sometimes waiting minutes before he answered, sometimes finding silence and an empty room. On the harder days he sat on his bed, staring into nothing, his thoughts already elsewhere. He spoke less now, and when he did his words felt heavy, as if each sentence cost him something precious. Doctors called this a flat phase, a side effect of medication, but to me it was like watching my child slowly disappear behind a thick wall. I tried to bring pieces of life back, music he once loved, favorite meals, old movies, but most attempts ended in silence or quiet frustration. Still I refused to stop because effort was the only way I knew to love. During this time I discovered how isolating mental illness could be. Friends who once promised to help stopped calling, relatives kept their distance, unsure what to say, or do I stopped explaining because explanations never seemed to change anything. People either stayed or they did not, and most did not. I felt invisible, carrying a burden few could understand. Yet, in that isolation, something unexpected happened. I began noticing small moments that felt like fragile victories. One afternoon he sat at the kitchen table sketching aimlessly on a scrap of paper, hand shaky but focused. It was the first time in months I had seen him engage with anything outside his own mind. I watched silently, afraid that speaking might break the moment. When he finished he pushed the paper toward me, and for the first time in a long while looked directly into my eyes. That drawing, simple, messy, unfinished, felt like proof. Some part of him was still reaching outward. I taped it to the refrigerator like treasure. In the weeks that followed, drawing became a quiet habit, not therapy, not a solution, just a place for his restless mind to rest. I encouraged it gently without pressure, because pressure had become our enemy. Some days he drew for hours, other days he could not pick up a pencil, but even on bad days he no longer seemed completely lost. Slowly I understood healing would not arrive as a dramatic change, but as small, almost invisible shifts earned painfully. At the same time my own body began to protest the constant strain. I lost weight, slept poorly, lived with a tight ache in my chest that never faded. I ignored it because there was no room for weakness. But late one night after he fell asleep I sat alone in darkness and felt a wave of exhaustion so deep it frightened me. I realized that if I broke there would be no one left to hold us together. That forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. I needed help, not just for him but for myself. Reaching out felt like admitting failure, but it was the opposite. It was survival. I joined a support group for caregivers, and for the first time sat in a room full of people who did not look away, people who nodded because they understood. The relief was overwhelming. I was not alone, and neither was my son. As winter turned into spring, the heaviness in our home softened slightly. We still lived carefully, still planned each day around medication and moods, but there was more space between crises, more moments to breathe. I did not call it hope, yet it felt real, something earned. For the first time since my husband's death, I allowed myself to believe our story was not finished, that even in brokenness there could be movement forward, one quiet step at a time. By summer something subtle had changed in our rhythm. While life was still fragile, it no longer felt like standing constantly at the edge of disaster. My son continued drawing, filling sketchbooks with faces, shapes, scenes that seemed to come from beyond words. He rarely explained meanings, and I learned not to ask because questions stirred voices. Instead I watched quietly, noticing posture relax, breathing slow as noise in his head finally found a channel. We began taking short, early morning walks, streets empty, world less threatening at first. He stayed close, scanning every sound, movement. Over time steps grew steadier, eyes lifted from ground. These walks became our unspoken agreement, our way of reminding each other we were still part of the world, even if moving through it differently. One afternoon he asked if we could visit a small art supply store nearby. The request startled me. He rarely asked for anything. I agreed immediately, afraid hesitation might close the door he had just opened. Inside, he moved slowly, touching paper, brushes, pencils with reverence as fragile treasures, choosing a simple set of charcoal sticks, hands trembling slightly. I realized the courage this small moment required. For him this was not shopping, it was risk, it was hope. The days that followed were filled with quiet focus. He drew at the kitchen table by the window late into evening, sometimes losing track of time. I saw flashes of the boy he used to be, curious, thoughtful, deeply sensitive. Though the illness had not disappeared, it loosened grip just enough to let his true self surface. At the same time I began reclaiming pieces of my own identity beyond caregiving. I continued attending support groups, sharing stories, listening, learning that strength did not mean endless endurance, it meant adaptation, boundaries, forgiveness. I started writing again late at night after he slept, filling notebooks with thoughts buried for years. Writing became my release, my way of processing grief, anger, love, all tangled. I wrote about my husband, about life we had planned, about the woman I was, and the woman I was becoming. Through these acts, both my son and I were slowly redefining ourselves, not as victims of tragedy but as survivors, learning new languages for living. There were setbacks, days when voices returned louder, nights when fear crept back, but the difference was these moments no longer erased everything else. We had tools, routines, and most importantly trust. When he told me, voices growing stronger, we acted together, adjusting schedules, calling doctors, resting instead of panic. There was communication instead of collapse, there was response. This did not make the road easy but navigable. For the first time in years I could imagine a future, not perfect, not normal, but possible. And that possibility felt like a quiet victory earned through patience, resilience, unbreakable bond forged in loss. The shift in our daily rhythm continued subtly but unmistakably. As autumn approached, the world outside changed color and temperature, and something similar was happening inside my son. He began spending more time at the table by the window working on larger pieces of paper, experimenting with charcoal and ink, letting his hands move freely without overthinking. Every now and then he paused, stepped back, studied his work with a seriousness that reminded me of his father. The illness was still there, always present like a shadow, but it no longer controlled every moment. Instead, it hovered at the edges, watching while my son slowly reclaimed space for himself. One evening he asked if I would sit with him while he worked, and as we sat together in comfortable silence, I realized how far we had come from the days when silence felt dangerous. Now it felt shared and safe. He told me quietly that when he drew, the voices softened as if they respected the focus and left him alone. I did not fully understand how or why, but I did not need to. Art had become his refuge. His therapist noticed the change as well, encouraging him to continue and suggesting small achievable goals, nothing overwhelming, just steps that honored his limits. Together we set gentle expectations, daily routines, creative time, short outings, rest without guilt. The structure that once felt restrictive now felt supportive, giving shape to days that had once dissolved into chaos. I watched my son begin to take ownership of his illness, learning to recognize early signs, adjusting his pace, and asking for help before things spiraled. This awareness did not make him immune to pain, but it gave him agency, something the illness had long stolen from my perspective. As a mother, this shift was both comforting and terrifying. Letting him lead meant trusting that he could handle discomfort, that he could stumble and recover. It meant loosening my grip after years of holding on for dear life. Some days I failed, clinging too tightly, stepping in too quickly. But I was learning too. We were growing together in this new phase, defined not by crisis, but by cautious progress. One afternoon he asked if he could show his drawings to someone outside our home. The request filled me with both pride and fear, because exposure meant vulnerability. We talked about options and decided on a small local community art class that met once a week. I went with him the first time, sitting quietly in the back while he took a seat among strangers. His hands shook as he opened his sketchbook, but he stayed, he listened, he drew, and when the session ended he walked out with a faint smile that felt like a miracle. That night, he told me, he felt seen, not judged, not fixed, just seen. I cried quietly, overwhelmed by the weight of that simple statement. After years of being defined by illness, loss, and limitation, my son had found a place where he belonged, even if only for an hour a week. This did not erase the past or guarantee the future, but it marked a turning point, a moment when life expanded just enough to let light in, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe that growth was not only possible but already happening in ways both subtle and profound. The winter returned quietly, and with it a sense of reflection that settled over our home. The holidays arrived without the loud joy they once carried, but also without the crushing weight of despair that had defined earlier years. We decorated modestly, a small tree, simple lights, and my son's drawings pinned carefully to the wall as if they were ornaments of survival. He spent more time at his art class, now comfortable enough to go alone, and each week he returned with stories about techniques, conversations, and moments that made him feel part of something larger than his illness. I listened with a mix of pride and humility, aware that this independence had been hard-earned. The voices still visited him sometimes, especially when he was tired or overwhelmed. But they no longer ruled his days. He had learned how to ground himself, how to step back, and remind himself that they were symptoms, not truths. Watching him apply these tools felt like witnessing a quiet triumph. One evening as we sat together, he told me that art had given him a reason to stay present, that when he created he felt connected to life in a way he never thought possible again. His words carried a depth that only suffering could carve. And I realized that while his path would always be different, it was no longer defined solely by pain. For me, the journey had changed as well. I was no longer just surviving each day, waiting for the next crisis. I had learned how to rest, how to ask for help, and how to honor my own grief without letting it consume me. My husband was still deeply missed, his absence a permanent ache, but I no longer felt abandoned by life. I felt reshaped. Looking back, I could see how every dark chapter had quietly prepared us for this steadier ground, not by erasing the past but by teaching us endurance, compassion, and adaptability. This story does not end with a cure or a dramatic transformation, because that is not how real life works. It ends with something quieter, and perhaps more powerful: a mother and son who learned how to live with uncertainty without surrendering to it. We learned that healing is not about returning to who we were, but about becoming who we are now, shaped by loss yet capable of meaning. Love did not fix everything, but it carried us through. And in that persistence, in that refusal to give up, we found a future that, while imperfect, was real and worth holding on to. The months that followed unfolded quietly but steadily, like the slow turning of seasons. Each day was a careful choreography of small victories and fragile routines. I watched my son navigate his world with a growing awareness that both amazed and terrified me. He learned to recognize the subtle signs of a looming breakdown: the racing thoughts, the creeping paranoia, the restless energy that signaled the voices were returning, and together we developed a code, a way to communicate before the storm became unmanageable. Some days were brighter than others, and those were the days I clung to. They were filled with laughter at a joke remembered from years past, the comfort of a warm cup of tea shared in silence, the gentle pride in his eyes when he realized he had completed a drawing without interruption. These were the moments that reminded me of who he truly was beyond the illness. We continued to take walks, sometimes short, sometimes longer, depending on his comfort, and the world around us slowly became less menacing for him. I noticed how the light in the morning seemed to catch on his face differently, how the wind no longer seemed like a threat, but a gentle brush against his skin. Our shared silence during these walks became a language in itself, a reassurance that we were still present in the world, even if the world often felt hostile to him. I also began to reclaim parts of myself that had been buried under grief and caregiving. I returned to my support group, sharing both triumphs and setbacks, learning that my strength did not lie in endless endurance, but in boundaries, patience, and self-compassion. I picked up writing again late at night after my son had fallen asleep, filling notebooks with a tangled web of grief, love, fear, and hope. I wrote about my husband, about our life together, about the mother I had been and the mother I was becoming. Writing became a tether, a way to process the pain that otherwise threatened to overwhelm me. In the home we built around careful routines, I began to notice small but profound changes in my son. He started to initiate small tasks on his own, drawing in the mornings without prompt, preparing a simple snack for himself, taking a shower with less anxiety. Each small act was a step toward independence, and with each step he gained confidence, and I gained a fragile hope that life could continue beyond mere survival. The challenges, of course, never disappeared. The voices would return, particularly in moments of fatigue or stress, and with them came anxiety and fear. But now he had tools and understanding, and I had patience and vigilance. Together we could navigate these crises without them erasing the fragile gains we had made. We also began to explore new ways for him to express himself creatively, not just through drawing but through journaling, poetry, and even short stories, encouraging him gently without pressure. I watched as he discovered new avenues to process the tumultuous thoughts and emotions inside him. He occasionally shared his work with me, and I responded with care and curiosity, focusing on the process, not the product. Each piece was a small victory, a tangible sign that he was reclaiming his mind from the illness that had dominated it for so long. Slowly our home transformed from a place of constant vigilance and fear to one of quiet resilience and cautious optimism. We celebrated small milestones together, his ability to manage medication for a week without reminder, the first time he attended an art class alone, his first smile after days of withdrawal. Each of these moments felt monumental because they were hard-earned and deeply significant. I also found comfort and purpose in building connections with other families navigating similar challenges. Learning from them and sharing my own experiences created a sense of community that had been absent during the initial years of crisis. We began to see that we were not isolated in our struggles, that strength could be found in collective resilience as well as personal perseverance. There were nights when I still lay awake, haunted by what had been lost and what could be lost again, but I learned to face these fears with recognition and intention rather than letting them consume me. I created rituals to manage my anxiety, daily affirmations for both myself and my son, reminders that we were capable of surviving another day. Together we marked time not by the events we missed or the losses we had suffered, but by the small victories, the quiet moments of connection, the shared breaths in moments of tension. The illness still shaped our lives in profound ways, but it no longer dictated every movement, every thought, every possibility. I began to see him as more than a patient, more than a diagnosis, more than the sum of his struggles. He was my son, my companion, my student in resilience and creativity, and in him I found the courage to redefine what life could mean for both of us. We started planning small outings further from home, short trips to parks and museums, careful steps into the world beyond our apartment. Our son initially resisted these adventures with understandable fear, but gradually he began to anticipate them with cautious excitement. Each successful outing reinforced his sense of capability and expanded the boundaries of what he believed was possible. The process was slow, painstakingly slow, but it was progress, and with it came hope, not as a fleeting illusion but as a tangible reality we were building together. The bond between us strengthened into a relationship of mutual trust and respect rather than dependence and fear. I began to recognize the importance of allowing him agency, even when it felt risky to do so. Every choice he made for himself became a test of trust and a step toward autonomy, and I learned to step back without abandoning support, to watch him navigate challenges and triumphs in his own way. By mid-year, I noticed a subtle shift in the energy of our home. The air felt lighter, laughter more frequent, the presence of fear and despair less suffocating. Our routines still structured our days, but within those structures there was space for spontaneity, for creativity, for connection. We had learned to survive, now we were learning to live. This period of transformation was not marked by dramatic events or breakthroughs, but by cumulative moments small enough to be almost invisible to outsiders yet monumental to those living them. We had discovered that resilience is not a sudden act of heroism but a slow accumulation of daily victories, small moments of courage repeated over and over, until they become the new normal. Our story was evolving into one of quiet triumphs and steady recovery, not despite the illness but alongside it, not through miracles but through patience, understanding, and unwavering love. The following months unfolded like a careful dance between caution and curiosity, each day a delicate negotiation of boundaries and possibilities. I watched my son grow in ways both subtle and profound. He began to initiate conversations with a tentative confidence, asking about the world outside our home, about the people around him, about ideas he had never expressed aloud before. Each question was a triumph, each hesitation a lesson in patience. I learned to celebrate not just the answers but the courage it took for him to ask. The routines that had once felt confining now became scaffolding, supporting his gradual emergence into the world beyond our apartment. We established morning rituals that included a short walk to a nearby cafe where he could sit quietly and observe life in motion, without expectation, without pressure. He began to notice details: the way sunlight hit the pavement, the sounds of distant conversations, the rhythm of passing footsteps. Each observation was a small claim on reality, a reassurance that the world could be experienced safely. Once again, art remained his refuge, and over time it expanded to include painting and collage. Sometimes he would work for hours at the kitchen table, losing himself in shapes and colors while I quietly prepared meals or folded laundry nearby. I resisted the urge to interrupt or correct, instead allowing the flow of creativity to guide him. Even on days when the voices returned, his art seemed to provide a tether, a place where he could anchor himself and reclaim moments of peace. We also experimented with controlled exposure to social situations, first brief interactions with neighbors, then small visits to local shops, each time assessing his comfort and readiness. I learned to read his cues, the subtle tightening of his shoulders, the flicker of his eyes toward the exit, the way he held his hands. These signals informed our pace, ensuring that we did not push too fast and risk regression. Slowly but surely he began to navigate these interactions with increasing confidence, a brief greeting here, a nod of acknowledgement there. These small achievements strengthened his sense of agency, and reminded me that progress was not linear but cumulative and deeply personal. In parallel, I focused on rebuilding my own life beyond caregiving. I resumed part-time work, connecting with colleagues through projects that allowed me to contribute while maintaining the flexibility needed to respond to his needs. I carved out moments for writing, for reflection, for quiet walks that reminded me that I too was more than the sum of my responsibilities. This balance between presence for him and presence for myself became essential for sustaining both of us. Our evenings evolved into a rhythm of shared activity and quiet companionship. Sometimes we cooked together, experimenting with new recipes. Sometimes we watched films discussing characters and choices, and other times we simply sat in companionable silence, reading or sketching. The shared routines created a sense of stability that extended beyond immediate safety. They fostered connection and trust, reminding both of us that life could be shared even in its fragility. We continued to rely on professional support, his psychiatrist and therapist providing guidance, medication adjustments, and strategies for coping with stress and sensory overload. These interventions, combined with our carefully constructed home routines, created a network of support that allowed him to explore the world safely while providing me with reassurance that we were not navigating the complexity of mental illness alone. Yet progress was never without setbacks. Occasionally a sudden change in routine, a loud noise, a missed appointment, or an unexpected interaction would trigger intense anxiety or a brief episode of paranoia and hallucination. Each time we faced the storm together, assessing, supporting, and adapting. Our response evolved from panic to calm problem-solving, recognizing that these episodes were moments, not definitions, and that survival was continuous, cumulative work, rather than singular heroic acts. We also began exploring community connections for him through art therapy groups and local support programs, cautiously at first. Then, with increasing independence, each session he attended reinforced a sense of belonging, a reminder that he was part of a larger network of individuals navigating similar challenges. The interaction with peers fostered empathy, shared learning, and social skills without the pressure of conventional social norms. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to understand that the world outside our apartment could be navigated safely, and that relationships could exist beyond fear and control. Through all of this, I noticed the emergence of his voice, once subdued, now growing more assertive. He expressed preferences clearly about art projects, about outings, about meals, and gradually even about his treatment decisions. These assertions, small as they may have seemed, were monumental in rebuilding autonomy and self-efficacy within the context of chronic mental illness. I documented these milestones quietly in notebooks, not as evidence of perfection but as markers of persistence, courage, and resilience, each page a reminder that the work of healing and living was continuous and cumulative, not a single event or moment of transformation parallel to his growth. I continued cultivating my own resilience, attending support groups, sharing experiences, listening and learning from others, navigating caregiving for loved ones with mental illness. I discovered strategies for managing my anxiety and grief, techniques for self-care, and the importance of community in sustaining long-term endurance. The integration of support, structure, creative expression, and mutual trust began to transform our home from a place of fear and isolation to one of tentative stability and potential for growth. Even setbacks became opportunities for learning and reflection, each episode reinforcing the importance of vigilance, empathy, and adaptability. Our home, once defined by chaos and uncertainty, was slowly becoming a place where life could be lived with intention, creativity, and cautious hope. I began to teach him simple mindfulness practices, techniques for grounding himself when the voices intensified, and for observing his thoughts without immediate reaction. These exercises were not a cure but a toolset, providing him with agency and a sense of control over experiences that once dominated his existence. The gradual accumulation of these strategies began to shift the balance between fear and control, allowing him to experience moments of clarity and engagement with the world without immediate disruption or overwhelm. As the months passed, I observed him beginning to take more initiative in daily tasks, personal hygiene, and even social interaction. Each small success was celebrated with verbal acknowledgement and gentle encouragement, reinforcing both competence and confidence. The attention to progress, rather than perfection, created a sustainable trajectory toward independence while maintaining a safety net of care and support. Our story continued as a complex interplay of routine, creativity, vigilance, and care, a continuous negotiation between limitations and potential, and through it all a growing understanding that healing is incremental, resilience is relational, and love is both a shield and a bridge. We were learning together not to be defined by illness or tragedy but to inhabit our lives fully within the constraints we faced, embracing both fragility and strength, recognizing that survival and living are intertwined ongoing processes. This new rhythm was neither dramatic nor sensational but profoundly significant, each day marked by incremental progress, shared presence, and the quiet cultivation of trust, agency, and creativity. Our son's journey from withdrawal to cautious engagement, from fear to measured curiosity, reflected both his courage and the unwavering commitment of a mother determined to hold space for growth. Even amidst the persistent shadow of illness, the transformation was not linear. It was layered and subtle, built upon countless small victories and setbacks, an accumulation of moments that together redefined what life could mean for both of us. The following year unfolded with a rhythm that was at once fragile and persistent, each day a careful negotiation between progress and potential pitfalls. I observed my son's cautious reclamation of independence, and noted the ways he began to assert choice over his environment, over his art, over even small daily routines. This newfound agency was not absolute, but incremental, a series of micro-decisions that signaled he was learning to inhabit his life, rather than merely endure it. We continued the practice of short walks and outings, gradually expanding their duration and complexity, at first just to the corner store, then to nearby parks, then local cafes and small art supply shops. Each excursion was carefully planned with contingency strategies for moments of distress, a favorite blanket, a familiar playlist, or a quiet corner to retreat if the world became too loud. Slowly, he learned to navigate external stimuli with greater confidence, noticing details, the way sunlight filtered through trees, the rhythm of pedestrian footsteps. The ordinary moments that once provoked anxiety now became small markers of presence. I encouraged journaling alongside his art, sometimes prompting him to write a sentence or two about his day or a feeling he noticed, but without expectation or critique. This combination of visual and written expression became a therapeutic bridge, a means for him to externalize internal chaos and reclaim narrative ownership of his experiences. In tandem, I continued rebuilding my life beyond caregiving, carving space for part-time work, social interactions, and personal reflection. I learned to pace myself, to accept that rest was not indulgence but necessity. Each evening we would share small rituals, a quiet meal, a sketching session, or a walk on the balcony as the sun set, moments that reinforced stability and connection. The voices persisted, sometimes emerging with intensity, but the strategies we had practiced, grounding techniques, controlled exposure, art as refuge, allowed us to respond without panic. These strategies became scaffolds supporting both his mental stability and my own capacity to hold space for him without collapse. I also became more deliberate about social reintegration, gently facilitating low-pressure interactions with a few trusted neighbors and peers. Through these carefully structured encounters, he began to experience reciprocity, empathy, and dialogue outside the immediate family, a reminder that human connection remained possible and meaningful even in the shadow of illness. Each success was small and often fleeting, yet cumulatively significant, reinforcing the notion that recovery is measured in incremental shifts rather than dramatic milestones over time. He initiated questions about broader interests, expressing curiosity about techniques in art, the natural world, and stories in books. He once ignored. These inquiries were subtle indicators that his engagement with life was expanding beyond mere survival, and that curiosity could coexist with the reality of illness. We introduced gentle structure into our days without rigidity, alternating quiet home time with controlled external activities, art, and mindful breathing exercises. These routines created a predictable framework within which he could experiment, fail, and recover without fear of catastrophic consequences. I documented these moments not as proof of perfection but as evidence of ongoing resilience and capacity for growth. Each sketch he completed, each sentence he wrote, was a claim on his life, a testament to persistence. Despite these gains, setbacks continued to arrive unpredictably. Loud noise, a sudden change in plan, an interpersonal misunderstanding that could trigger anxiety, hallucinations, or withdrawal. I learned to respond with calm observation, guiding without force, acknowledging emotion without judgment. Each event became a practice in patience, teaching both him and me that stability is relational and cumulative, rather than a static state. Our shared commitment to communication and gentle boundaries reinforced trust and created a sense of safety even during periods of uncertainty. At home, we continued to cultivate creativity and autonomy, gradually allowing him more control over his art projects and daily routines. These incremental decisions reinforced his sense of ownership over his life, slowly balancing the power dynamic that had long been defined by illness and caretaking. I also prioritized self-care, attending support groups for caregivers, writing in journals, and connecting with peers facing similar challenges. This external support allowed me to process grief, frustration, and hope in ways that prevented emotional collapse and enhanced my ability to be present and patient with him over months. These layered strategies coalesced into a rhythm of life that was neither problem-free nor predictable, but increasingly navigable. The household energy shifted from constant tension to cautious optimism, each small victory reinforcing the potential for stability and progress. Our relationship transformed as well, evolving from caretaker and dependent to a more collaborative partnership marked by shared responsibility, mutual acknowledgement, and growing respect for his autonomy. Even setbacks became opportunities for dialogue, reflection, and recalibration. We approached each new episode of distress as a problem to be solved together, a temporary state, rather than a defining identity. He learned to articulate discomfort, request help, and engage in grounding practices, while I learned to respond without overreaction to fear, voices, or withdrawal. This mutual adaptation created resilience beyond medication, therapy, or structured routines. It was a relational resilience built on trust, observation, and repeated practice. I noticed moments where he would smile or laugh spontaneously or comment on a detail in our environment. These flashes of engagement were precious indicators that his inner world was not wholly consumed by fear or hallucination. Each instance reminded me that despite chronic illness, growth, joy, and connection were possible. I also gradually reintroduced elements of community involvement for both of us, attending art shows or workshops where he could choose participation. These events were carefully scaffolded with exit strategies and sensory supports, but offered exposure to a broader social world, a context in which he could practice navigating complexity safely. The year's passage revealed a pattern of incremental autonomy, expanding creativity, and measured social reintegration, each day layered upon the last, a cumulative building of confidence, coping skills, and relational depth. The transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible to outsiders, yet profound. In lived experience, through careful pacing, structure, creativity, and mutual support, both of us learned that healing and living with chronic mental illness is an iterative process defined by persistence, adaptability, and relational trust rather than dramatic breakthroughs. I began to recognize and honor the subtleties of his achievements, understanding that a stable glance, a question asked, or a sketch completed were victories in a context where survival itself is an accomplishment. As the year closed, we reflected quietly on our progress, not as an endpoint but as evidence that life could continue with meaning, connection, and agency despite persistent challenges. We had cultivated a fragile but resilient ecosystem of care and autonomy, a foundation upon which further growth could be scaffolded and through which the seeds of hope, curiosity, and self-expression had begun to take root. Each day remained a negotiation, a practice in patience and love, but one increasingly marked by shared agency, trust, and the quiet recognition that life, though different, remained alive and expansive. The following months brought both progress and new challenges, teaching me that recovery is never linear and that resilience is measured in small, repeated efforts rather than grand gestures. Each morning began with a quiet ritual of preparation: coffee brewed, windows opened, gentle stretches to wake the body and mind. I would check in with my son, not with directives or pressure, but with simple presence and observation, noting changes in posture, facial expression, or tone of voice that might signal emerging stress or discomfort. He began to anticipate these moments, sometimes smiling softly as if recognizing that our shared rituals were anchors in a world that often felt unpredictable. As the seasons shifted, we experimented with incremental freedom, allowing him to take short walks alone while I observed from a distance, or choose meals, clothing, and art projects independently. These small exercises in autonomy were fraught with risk, yet vital for rebuilding confidence and trust in his own judgment. Gradually, he began initiating interactions outside our home, attending a weekly art class where peers offered quiet encouragement and shared interest in creativity. The first few sessions were tentative, his hands trembling as he opened sketchbooks, voice barely audible when speaking to instructors or classmates, but over time, he grew steadier, engaging with others while still retreating when overwhelmed. The art classroom became a microcosm of growth, a controlled environment where mistakes were safe, curiosity encouraged, and personal expression valued. For me, these moments were bittersweet. I celebrated his courage and independence while grappling with the constant awareness that the illness still lurked at the edges, capable of pulling him back into fear or withdrawal with little warning. I continued attending caregiver support groups, learning to manage my own emotional needs, establish boundaries, and practice self-compassion. This external support fortified me, allowing me to respond to crises with calm rather than panic, and to witness his progress without clinging to control or perfection. Within the home, we refined routines that balanced structure and flexibility: medication times, meals, art sessions, brief outdoor walks interspersed with periods of quiet, self-directed activity. This rhythm provided predictability without rigidity and helped mitigate anxiety or hallucinations. We celebrated milestones large and small, from a completed sketchbook to a day spent without significant distress, or the first full week of consistent engagement with the art class. Each success was documented silently in my journal, a record of cumulative growth that gave me tangible evidence of progress even when external validation was absent. Setbacks inevitably arrived, sometimes abruptly: a sudden panic episode, hallucinations, or a day where words failed him entirely. I learned to meet these with calm observation, gentle guidance, and reassurance rather than frustration or despair. These moments became lessons in patience and resilience, teaching both of us that stability is relational and iterative rather than absolute. Over time, he began experimenting with new media: charcoal, ink, collage, sometimes abandoning projects midway, but increasingly finishing others. These acts of creation were not just artistic expression but mechanisms for managing internal chaos and asserting control over his life. I encouraged reflection without pressure, asking him to describe what he saw or felt, fostering awareness and self-expression without imposing expectations. My own creativity re-emerged alongside his. I returned to writing, capturing the rhythms of our days, the nuanced shifts in his behavior, my own reflections on grief, hope, and endurance. Writing became a form of processing, a way to contextualize trauma and track subtle victories simultaneously. Through this dual engagement in art and writing, we forged a shared culture of expression, a protective and generative space in which our lives could be both observed and celebrated as they unfolded. As confidence grew, we expanded social interactions, cautiously inviting trusted friends into our home and participating in small community events. This exposure reinforced agency, perspective, and connection, reminding him and me that life could encompass more than illness. Despite ongoing challenges, I observed an internal shift. He began verbalizing insights into his own patterns, Recognizing early signs of distress and practicing coping strategies proactively, these developments signaled emerging metacognition and self-regulation, a reclaiming of power and autonomy. After years dominated by fear and symptom management, we continued balancing external support and personal agency. Weekly check-ins with therapists, consistent routines at home, and exposure to creative, social, and recreational opportunities, all carefully calibrated to prevent overwhelm. The process demanded relentless attention, adaptation, and patience, but cultivated a foundation for longer-term stability and growth. During this period, I also worked to normalize discussion of feelings and setbacks, modeling vulnerability and constructive problem-solving. His responses, though sometimes delayed or inconsistent, increasingly reflected understanding and trust in our collaborative approach. These incremental exchanges nurtured relational depth, allowing shared resilience to emerge organically without coercion or fear. As the months progressed, we celebrated quiet victories, a series of uninterrupted nights of sleep, a sketchbook completed, a spontaneous conversation about his future, or memories of his father. Each instance reinforced that recovery, creativity, and engagement could coexist with chronic mental illness. The household dynamic transformed from one of constant vigilance and tension to a rhythm marked by deliberate care, mutual respect, and cautious optimism. The voices and anxiety persisted but no longer dominated his world or ours entirely. Instead, they became components to be managed, acknowledged, and incorporated into a broader pattern of life with agency and meaning. Observing these shifts, I began to accept that life after trauma and chronic illness is a series of negotiations, choices, and experiments rather than a fixed narrative. Each small success compounded over time, creating a cumulative effect that reshaped our experiences of stability, autonomy, and hope. By the end of this period, I could witness his emergence as a person increasingly capable of self-expression, engagement, and emotional regulation. Even amid persistent challenges, our shared narrative had evolved from one dominated by fear, grief, and survival to one incorporating creativity, autonomy, and relational resilience. The illness remained present, a constant backdrop, yet the story was no longer defined by it alone. We had cultivated a life in which meaning, agency, and connection could thrive despite ongoing adversity. The following months brought a delicate balance of hope, progress, and vigilance, teaching me that life with chronic mental illness is never straightforward, but instead a continuous negotiation of care, autonomy, and resilience. Each day began quietly before dawn with my son still asleep, the house wrapped in soft shadows and the faint hum of the city beyond our windows. I made coffee, prepared breakfast, and reviewed the day's gentle schedule, ensuring it offered both structure and flexibility while leaving space for spontaneity or rest. When my son awoke, I greeted him calmly, offering choice and agency in small decisions: what to wear, which sketchbook to use, whether to take a short walk, all designed to reinforce his sense of control without overwhelming him. Our mornings gradually became predictable rituals filled with quiet companionship, light conversation, and mutual observation, teaching us to notice subtle changes in mood, posture, or focus that could indicate stress or emerging voices. Slowly, he began asserting more independence, venturing on short walks alone, engaging briefly with neighbors, and expressing curiosity about the world outside our carefully curated routines. Each step forward was measured, cautious, and sometimes faltered, yet each faltering became an opportunity to learn, recalibrate, and reinforce trust in his own abilities. His art continued to serve as both refuge and medium of communication, growing in sophistication and scope, providing insight into his inner world while offering him a sense of accomplishment and self-expression. I encouraged reflection without pressure, letting him describe or not describe his work, honoring both his autonomy and his vulnerability. Participation in the weekly art class became a cornerstone of our routine, a safe space where he could interact with peers, receive gentle feedback, and experiment with new techniques. The first few sessions had been tentative, his hands trembling as he opened sketchbooks, voice barely audible as he responded to classmates or instructors. Yet over months I witnessed subtle yet meaningful growth. His posture relaxed, his attention lengthened, and he began forming tentative social connections without my intervention. These developments reflected both his increasing self-confidence and the quiet but steady reclaiming of agency over his life. Meanwhile, I nurtured my own resilience by attending caregiver support groups, writing, and connecting with friends who understood the unique challenges of parenting a child with schizophrenia. These outlets were essential for maintaining emotional equilibrium, allowing me to respond to crises with calm and clarity while modeling healthy coping for my son. I refined home routines that balanced predictability and flexibility, from medication schedules and meal times to quiet creative sessions and brief outdoor walks. The goal was not rigid control but a rhythm that supported stability, mitigated triggers, and fostered independence when setbacks occurred. A night of heightened voices, anxiety, or hallucinations. I learned to respond with observation, reassurance, and gentle guidance rather than panic or frustration. Each incident became an opportunity to teach coping strategies, reinforce safety, and validate emotions without reinforcing fear. Over time, my son began demonstrating metacognitive skills, recognizing early signs of stress, communicating needs, and implementing coping strategies proactively. This reclamation of agency marked a profound shift in our dynamic, signaling the emergence of autonomy alongside ongoing support. Our home gradually transformed from a place of constant vigilance to one of deliberate care, creativity, and cautious optimism. Milestones, no matter how small, were celebrated. A sketchbook completed, a week of uninterrupted sleep, a spontaneous conversation, a visit to the art store without hesitation. Each one evidence of growth and resilience despite the persistent presence of voices and anxiety. These elements no longer dominated his life entirely. Instead, they became challenges to manage, acknowledged without letting them define him or our shared experience. I observed my son reclaiming parts of himself lost to illness, and in parallel, I began reclaiming my own identity beyond caregiving. Late-night writing, moments of solitude, and gentle self-care reinforced my capacity to remain present, patient, and emotionally regulated. As our rhythm stabilized, we cautiously expanded social engagement, inviting trusted friends, participating in small community events, and fostering connections that reinforced belonging and perspective. These interactions, though limited, helped both of us recognize that life could encompass joy, curiosity, and growth even amid chronic challenges. Over time, a pattern emerged. An equilibrium built from small victories, daily care, structured creativity, and relational trust. We could navigate crises, setbacks, and unexpected challenges with communication, planning, and patience rather than panic. The illness remained a constant backdrop, but it no longer defined the story alone. Instead, our narrative encompassed resilience, adaptation, creativity, and connection. Elements we actively cultivated and safeguarded. I realized that healing and stability are not destinations but ongoing processes shaped by consistency, reflection, and courage. Each incremental step forward, each moment of autonomy or expression, each act of care, both given and received, contributed to a slowly widening space of possibility. By the time winter approached once again, the home felt steadier, lighter, and infused with subtle hope. My son's engagement with art had deepened, his sketches more expressive, intricate, and intentional. He experimented with mediums, explored new techniques, and occasionally shared glimpses of insight into his work without pressure or expectation. This process nurtured a sense of identity beyond illness and reinforced his growing self-awareness. I continued documenting our journey in writing, capturing the nuances of progress, setbacks, and daily life. These reflections allowed me to see cumulative growth that was easy to overlook in the moment. Each day, we practiced patience, celebration, and careful observation, understanding that stability is fragile yet attainable. Our shared experiences strengthened trust, communication, and the capacity to adapt, fostering relational resilience that became a foundation for ongoing life. Despite the inevitable challenges, setbacks, and moments of fear, I could finally see a future that was neither perfect nor free from illness but filled with potential, meaning, and human connection. The story we had written together was one of survival, endurance, and quiet triumph, not defined by the absence of hardship but by our capacity to meet it with courage, creativity, and love. We had learned that healing is not about returning to a previous state but about discovering new ways to live fully despite limitations. That evening, as my son worked at the kitchen table by the window, sunlight streaming across scattered pencils and sketchbooks, he looked up and asked if I could sit with him while he drew. The simple request carried a profound significance. It was a gesture of trust, an invitation into his world, and a signal that connection and safety had been restored even in the presence of chronic struggle. I sat beside him, quietly observing the pencil glide across paper, feeling a sense of completion and continuity in our journey. I understood then that life would remain unpredictable, that voices, fear, and challenges would persist. Yet our relationship, routines, and shared resilience had created a platform from which both of us could navigate the uncertainty with agency, hope, and dignity. This story does not end with a miraculous cure or dramatic transformation. It ends with a mother and son who have learned to live alongside uncertainty, grief, and mental illness while cultivating meaning, connection, and self-expression. We had discovered that healing is iterative, nuanced, and deeply human, and that love, patience, and persistence can carry us through even the darkest chapters. One could finally allow myself to believe that our story, though imperfect, was real, unfolding, and worth living every day.